Something had changed, and Daniel felt it before he could understand it. It began on an ordinary evening, the kind that used to feel warm without effort. He came home from work expecting the usual Alona's soft smile. The gentle sound of her voice, the small comfort of knowing he wasn't alone. But that night she barely looked up from her phone. She greeted him, but the warmth was missing. It wasn't cold. Just distant. At first, he ignored it. Everyone has off days, he told himself, but then the next day felt the same. And the next. Soon, Daniel noticed the pattern. Alina was still there, physically present in every room they shared, but something inside her had pulled away. She spoke less. She laughed less. Even the way she moved felt quieter, like she was trying not to be noticed. The house, once full of life, began to feel strangely silent. Daniel tried not to overthink it. He focused on work, on small routines, on anything that could keep his mind busy. But at night, when everything slowed down, the silence became louder. They would lie in bed just a few inches apart. But it felt like miles. Alina would turn to her side, facing away from him. "I'm tired," she would say softly. Daniel would nod, even though she couldn't see him in the dark. "Yeah, me too," he would reply. But he wasn't tired. Not really. He would stay awake long after she had fallen asleep, staring at the ceiling, listening to the quiet rhythm of her breathing. There was a time when that sound brought him peace. Now it only reminded him of the distance growing between them. Days turned into weeks. Daniel began to notice the little things he had once taken for granted. Alina no longer waited for him at dinner. Sometimes she had already eaten. Other times she said she wasn't hungry. They stopped watching shows together. Their conversations became short and practical about bills, groceries, schedules, nothing deeper, nothing real. One evening, Daniel decided to try again. He found her in the kitchen, standing by the counter, staring at nothing. "Hey," he said gently. She looked at him, her expression calm but unreadable. "Hey." He hesitated for a moment, choosing his words carefully. "Is everything okay?" he asked. It was a simple question, but it carried everything he had been holding inside. Alina smiled, but it didn't reach her eyes. "Yeah, I'm fine. Just work stuff." Daniel studied her face, searching for something real, something honest. "What kind of work stuff?" he asked. She shrugged lightly. "Just busy. Deadlines. You know how it is." He nodded slowly, even though he didn't feel satisfied with the answer. "Yeah, I get it," he said. But he didn't. He wanted to ask more. He wanted to tell her how he felt, how the silence was starting to hurt, how he missed her even when she was right in front of him. But the words stayed inside because something about her tone, her distance, made him feel like he was standing at a closed door and he didn't know how to knock anymore, so he stepped back. "Let me know if you need anything," he said softly. "I will," she replied, but they both knew she wouldn't. That night, the distance felt heavier. Daniel lay beside her, staring into the darkness. He turned slightly, hoping maybe she would turn too, that somehow they would meet halfway. But she stayed still, facing away. The space between them felt larger than ever. Weeks passed, and Daniel slowly stopped trying. Not because he didn't care, but because every attempt felt like reaching into emptiness. He started coming home later, sometimes taking longer routes just to delay the quiet waiting that filled their house. When he did come home, Alina was often busy or distracted. She spent more time on her phone, her attention always somewhere else. Daniel noticed that she smiled at her screen more than she smiled at him. That thought stayed with him longer than he expected. Still, he said nothing. Instead, he observed. He noticed how she dressed differently for work. No more effort, more detail, like she was preparing for something important. He noticed how she checked the time more often, how she seemed more alert when messages came in. It wasn't obvious, but it was enough to make him wonder. One evening, he sat alone in the living room while Alina was in the bedroom. The TV was on, but he wasn't watching it. His mind kept replaying moments, searching for answers. When had things started to change? Was it something he said? Something he didn't say? Had he become too predictable? Too distant himself? The questions circled endlessly, but none of them brought clarity. After a while, Lena walked into the room. "I might have to stay late tomorrow," she said casually. Daniel looked at her. Again. She nodded. "Yeah, it's just a busy week." He forced a small smile. "All right." She paused for a moment as if considering something, then added, "There's also a company party this weekend." Daniel raised an eyebrow slightly. "Oh yeah," she said. "It's nothing big. Just a work thing." "Sounds nice," he replied. She shrugged. "You can come if you want." The way she said it felt light, almost like it didn't matter whether he came or not. Daniel nodded slowly. "I'll think about it, 'kay?" she said. Before turning and walking away, that brief conversation stayed with him longer than he expected. Not because of the party, but because of how little it seemed to matter to her. That night, as they lay in bed, Daniel found himself staring at the ceiling again. For months. It had been almost 4 months since things started to change. For months of quiet dinners. For months of short conversations. For months of sleeping beside someone who felt far away. He turned his head slightly. Looking at Alina's back, she looked peaceful. Unaffected. And that hurt more than anything. Because he wasn't okay. He felt the absence of her in every moment they shared. But she seemed to have learned how to live with the distance. That thought settled heavily in his chest for the first time. Daniel allowed himself to consider something he had been avoiding. What if this wasn't temporary? What if this was who they had become? The idea scared him, not because he was angry, but because he still cared. He still remembered how things used to be. The laughter, the small touches, the way they used to talk for hours without noticing time now. Even a few minutes of conversation felt forced. Daniel closed his eyes. But sleep didn't come easily. His mind kept returning to the same quiet question. What was really happening to them? And why did it feel like he was the only one trying to find the answer? The next morning, nothing changed. Alina woke up, got ready for work, and left with a quick goodbye. Daniel stood by the door for a moment after she left, staring at the empty space she had occupied just seconds before. The silence returned instantly, and with it, the feeling he couldn't shake. Something was slipping away, and he didn't know how to hold onto it anymore. That's when a quiet decision began to form in his mind. He couldn't keep living like this, guessing, wondering, waiting. If Alina wouldn't open up at home, then maybe he needed to see her somewhere. Else somewhere she felt more like herself. His thoughts returned to the party. Maybe that was his chance not to confront, not to accuse, but to understand. For the first time in weeks, Daniel felt a small sense of clarity. He didn't know what he would find, but he knew one thing for sure. He couldn't ignore the distance anymore, and whatever truth was waiting for him, he was finally ready to face it. The night of the party arrived faster than Daniel expected, and with it came a quiet tension he couldn't ignore. He stood in front of the mirror longer than usual, adjusting his shirt, fixing details that normally wouldn't matter. It wasn't about impressing anyone. It was about reminding himself who he used to be. For months, he had felt invisible in his own home, like a shadow moving through familiar spaces. Tonight felt different. Tonight, he wasn't going just as Elena's husband. He was going to see the truth for himself. When they arrived at the venue, the atmosphere felt warm and alive. Soft, golden lights filled the room. Music played gently in the background. And groups of people stood close together, laughing like they had no worries at all. It looked like the kind of place where connections grew easily. Daniel glanced at Elena as they entered, and for a moment he almost didn't recognize her. She looked radiant. Her hair was styled carefully, her dress elegant, her expression lighter than anything he had seen in months. She walked into the room with quiet confidence, like this was her world, like she belonged here in a way she no longer did at home. "Let's go," she said softly, already moving forward. Daniel followed, his chest tight with a feeling he couldn't fully name. Within minutes, Alina was surrounded by people. Colleagues greeted her warmly, calling her name, pulling her into conversations. She smiled easily, laughed without hesitation, her voice carrying a warmth Daniel hadn't heard in a long time. He stood slightly behind at first. Watching, it wasn't just that she was talking, it was how alive she seemed. The same woman who barely spoke at home was now glowing. In a room full of people, that realization hit him harder than anything else. He had spent months wondering what was wrong with her. But here, in this moment, she didn't look broken at all. She looked happy. Just not with him. Daniel felt something shift inside his chest. It wasn't anger, and it wasn't jealousy. It was something quieter. Deeper realization that he had been holding on to an image of their life that no longer existed. For a brief moment, he considered leaving, just turning around, walking out, and avoiding whatever truth was unfolding in front of him. But he didn't single quotes T. instead. He took a slow breath and stepped further into the room. If this was where Alina felt like herself, then this was where he needed to understand her. He moved away from the crowd surrounding her, finding a quieter corner where he could observe without being noticed. From there, he watched the small details, the way she leaned into conversations, the way her eyes lit up when someone spoke, the way she carried herself with ease. It wasn't forced, it wasn't fake, it was real, and that made it harder to ignore. As the minutes passed, Daniel noticed something else. People were naturally drawn to Alina, but they also responded to her energy. She wasn't distant here. She wasn't quiet. She wasn't pulling away. She was open, and for the first time. Daniel wondered if the distance between them wasn't just about her pulling away, but about both of them slowly losing connection without realizing it. That thought lingered as he straightened his posture. Adjusting his mindset, he had come here searching for answers. But maybe the answer wasn't something he would find in interactions alone. Maybe it had something to do with him too, instead of standing back. Daniel made a small but important decision. He stepped forward. He walked toward a nearby group of people and introduced himself with a calm, confident tone. At first, it felt unfamiliar. He hadn't done this in a long time. For months, he had been quiet, reserved, caught up in his own thoughts, but slowly, something shifted. The conversation flowed naturally. He found himself smiling, responding, asking questions, engaging in a way he hadn't in weeks. The more he spoke, the more comfortable he felt. It was like rediscovering a part of himself he had forgotten. The version of him that didn't overthink every moment. The version that simply existed. Present and alive. Time passed quickly after that. Daniel moved from one conversation to another. Not forcing anything, just allowing himself to be part of the moment. He didn't look at Alina constantly. He didn't follow her around. He simply lived in the space, just like everyone else, and without realizing it. That changed everything, because across the room, Alina noticed at first. It was just a glance. Then another got her attention, which had been focused entirely on her surroundings, began to shift toward him. She saw him laughing. She saw him talking with ease. She saw something she hadn't seen in a long time. Daniel, being himself again. There was something in the way she looked at him now, something uncertain, something curious. It wasn't the same distant expression he had grown used to. It was different. Daniel felt it too, even before he turned his head, when their eyes finally met. The moment felt quiet, almost suspended in time. For a second, neither of them moved. Then Daniel gave a small, calm smile before returning to his conversation. He didn't rush toward her. He didn't react. And that caught her off guard because, for months, he had been the one trying to reach her. Now, he wasn't. That shift in energy created something neither of them expected as the night continued. Alina found it harder to ignore him. Her conversations became slightly shorter, her focus divided. She looked in his direction more often, trying to understand what had changed. But Daniel didn't act differently toward Her, he wasn't cold. He wasn't distant. He was simply steady, present, but not chasing. For the first time in months, the balance between them had shifted. Later in the evening, the music softened and the crowd thinned slightly. People moved into smaller groups, conversations becoming quieter and more personal. Daniel stepped aside for a moment, standing near a window that overlooked the city lights. The view stretched far into the distance. Calm and steady, much like the feeling he had started to build inside himself. He wasn't searching anymore. He wasn't waiting. He was simply there. That's when he heard her voice. Daniel. He turned slowly. Alina stood a few steps away, her expression softer than before. There was a pause between them, but it didn't feel as heavy as the silence they shared at home. It felt different. Can we talk? She asked quietly. Daniel studied her for a moment. This was the moment he had imagined for weeks, the moment where everything would come out. But instead of feeling overwhelmed, he felt calm. Of course, he said. They stood there for a second longer before moving toward a quieter area. Away from the noise of the party, neither of them spoke immediately. But something had already. Not just in the situation, but in how they saw each other. Because for the first time in months, Alina wasn't pulling away and Daniel wasn't chasing. They were simply standing face to face, equal, and whatever came next would finally bring the truth they had both been avoiding. Daniel and Alina stepped out of the softly lit room and into a quiet corner of the building, away from the low hum of conversations and laughter. The air outside was cool, carrying the faint scent of spring flowers from nearby planters. The city lights flickered in the distance, casting soft glows on their faces. For the first time in months, they were alone together, not in the familiar comfort of home, but in a place where the distractions, the routines, the weight of everyday life weren't pressing in. And yet, the weight of what had been unsaid for so long felt heavier than ever. Alina shifted her stance slightly, her fingers brushing nervously against the strap of her dress. She took a deep breath, as if gathering courage from the night air. Daniel, she began, her voice barely above a whisper, but it carried enough weight to make him stop and focus entirely on her. He turned fully, his gaze steady, patient, ready for whatever she needed to say. I didn't realize how far we drifted, she admitted, her eyes not leaving his. There was vulnerability there, raw and unfiltered, and Daniel felt a pang of both relief and heartbreak. Relief because she was finally speaking honestly, heartbreak because it had taken so long for them to reach this point. I thought it was just stress, work, life. But it wasn't that simple, I felt. I don't know. Lost. Lost in myself, and somehow I stopped feeling connected to us. Daniel's heart ached. The words were familiar yet jarring, like a mirror reflecting months of distance back at him. He nodded slowly, absorbing each one. I felt it too, he admitted, his voice calm but honest. But I didn't know how to fix it. So I stayed quiet. I thought if I waited, maybe things would go back to how they were. His own voice sounded heavier than he expected, the weight of months of longing seeping through each syllable. There was a silence between them, but it wasn't empty. It was filled with every moment they had missed, every dinner eaten in silence, every conversation cut short, every night spent side by side without true connection. And yet, standing there, neither seemed to resent the other. They simply let the truth settle between them, heavy but necessary. Alina swallowed hard, her lips pressing into a thin line. I saw you tonight, she whispered, her voice trembling slightly. The way you smiled, how you spoke, how you seemed yourself again. And it reminded me of everything I missed, everything I lost while I was distant. She looked down, then back up at him, her eyes glistening. I forgot how it felt to see you happy, how it felt to be with you fully, without walls or distance. Daniel took a step closer, careful not to overwhelm her, but close enough that the warmth of his presence was undeniable. That version of me never left, he said gently. I just stopped showing up. But I can't let that happen anymore, not with us." He paused, letting his words sink in, letting the gravity of the moment settle around them. We have to choose to be present, to really be together. Otherwise, we risk losing more than we already have. Lena nodded, a single tear rolling down her cheek. "I don't want to lose this," she said softly. "I don't want to lose us." Her words were simple, but in their simplicity, they carried a lifetime of emotion: fear, longing, regret, hope. Daniel reached out, gently taking her hand in his. Their fingers intertwined naturally, like they were always meant to fit together this way. The touch wasn't sudden or forceful. It was steady, grounding, a silent promise that they could rebuild what had been strained. "Then we don't," he replied. "But it has to be different this time. We can't let silence and distance grow between us again. We have to speak, share, and face things together, no matter how uncomfortable it gets." Alina squeezed his hand, drawing strength from him, even as her own walls began to crumble. "I can do that," she whispered. "If you're with me." "I am," Daniel said, his voice firm, filled with quiet determination. "I've been waiting for this moment, not just for answers, but for us. And I promise I won't let the months of distance define what comes next. We start from here, together." For the first time in months, the weight of their unspoken words lifted slightly. There was still a long road ahead, full of conversations that needed to happen, feelings that needed to be acknowledged, and habits that had to be rebuilt. But for the first time in a long time, they felt like partners again, standing side by side, ready to face the reality of their connection. Alina let out a quiet breath she didn't realize she had been holding. "It feels like a beginning," she said. Her smile was tentative, fragile, yet genuine. It wasn't forced or performative. It was the smile of someone who had remembered what it meant to feel close to another person. Daniel smiled back, matching her vulnerability with his own. "A beginning," he agreed. "Not perfect, not without challenges, but real. And that's what matters." They stood there for a few more moments, simply holding hands, feeling the quiet energy between them. The city lights reflected in their eyes, soft and steady, mirroring the flicker of hope returning to their hearts. The party inside carried on, but it no longer mattered. For this night, for this moment, they had each other. And that was enough. Eventually, they moved back toward the venue, walking side by side, careful not to rush or force the moment. Every step felt deliberate, intentional, a silent acknowledgement that they were choosing each other again. The air between them was lighter now, the distance that had plagued them for months beginning to dissolve as they re-entered the softly lit room. Elena's hand remained in Daniel's. Conversations continued around them. Laughter rose and fell, but they were no longer part of the noise. They had found a quiet corner within themselves, a space where honesty, connection, and care could grow once more. No dramatic gestures, no sweeping declarations, just the simple truth of two people standing together after months of emotional separation. It was fragile, delicate, and beautiful in its simplicity. They both understood that rebuilding trust, intimacy, and closeness would take time. But the first step had been taken. For Daniel, it wasn't about proving anything to Alina anymore. It was about showing up fully, consistently, without letting fear or distance keep him silent. For Alina, it wasn't about apologizing endlessly or dwelling on the past. It was about recognizing the drift, acknowledging it, and being willing to step forward. Hand in hand with the person she had pulled away from, the night ended without fanfare. They left the party quietly, slipping into the car with the comfortable silence of shared understanding. The drive home was peaceful, filled with the subtle hum of tires on asphalt and the occasional soft comment about a light or a sound they noticed together. It was ordinary, yet it felt extraordinary when they finally returned home. The house no longer felt heavy with unspoken words. The rooms were the same, yet something fundamental had shifted. They moved through familiar spaces with renewed awareness, each gesture and glance carrying meaning. The bed, once a symbol of quiet distance, now felt like a place where connection could be reclaimed. Not hurried, not forced, but grown gradually with patience and care. That night, As they lay side by side, they didn't speak much. Words weren't needed. The simple presence of each other was enough. The silence that had once been painful now carried a sense of calm. They had faced the truth together, and that had begun to heal the fractures. Months of distance had created. Daniel reached over and lightly brushed a strand of hair from Elena's face. She closed her eyes, leaning slightly into the touch. There was no rush, no expectation, only the quiet understanding that they were finally present with one another. The past months of isolation, of emotional drift, hadn't vanished entirely, but they had acknowledged them, faced them, and decided together that they would not define their future. In that gentle, unassuming moment, the story of their separation and the months of silence found its resolution not through grand gestures, not through dramatic confessions, but through presence, honesty, and a shared commitment to start again. It was a delicate beginning, one that promised growth, understanding, and connection. As the night deepened, they drifted into sleep side by side, each feeling the warmth of the other's presence. A quiet reassurance that even after months of distance, love and understanding could still be found. And as they slept, the house that had once felt hollow now carried this subtle energy of hope and renewal. I promised that together they could rebuild what had been lost. The months of longing, heartbreak, and distance had not been wasted. They had brought clarity, honesty, and the first fragile steps toward reconnecting. And in that quiet, tender moment, both Daniel and Alina realized that the future, while uncertain, held the possibility of something deeper, something stronger, and something real. This was not the end of their story. It was a beginning, steady, grounded, and full of potential, a story they would write together, day by day, moment by moment, hand in hand.